We've been talking about just some really practical things in God's Word. Jesus sits down with people just like you and me one day, and he makes an invitation to begin following him. And I think the longer we follow Jesus, it's not that we have to change before we follow, but we'll change as we follow. And that's what Jesus invited people to do. Would you just start to follow me? And as you follow me, you're going to find that your life begins to change. And hopefully your life changes so much that people begin to see the life change in you. And when they see a life change in you, Jesus said you're going to be a little bit like a light in a dark place. You're going to illuminate and give hope and purpose and bring God's presence to their lives. And so we kind of been camping out on that a little bit. And last week we talked about that one of the greatest ways we can shed light into the culture and into the world that we live in is just by loving people like Jesus loved people. And we talked about a guy who wanted to know who his neighbor was because he kind of wanted to justify himself on who is worthy of my love and who isn't worthy. And Jesus kind of said, you know what? Your neighbor is anybody who needs compassion. And I think we all are bumping into people like this on a daily basis that just need compassion. That's our neighbor. And we just begin by loving those people. And when we do, we're shining our light into their dark lives and into a dark world. And that's what Jesus asked us to do. On this journey, we kind of get the journey. We're supposed to love Jesus. And there's an element of ease to that. I mean, it can be a little bit challenging in our lives, but I think the bigger challenge we face is not loving Jesus. Sometimes it's loving people. And it's difficult sometimes to love people. And we've kind of been talking that the church hasn't always gotten this right, but I want to share my heart with you so that we can get this right. Because if we love Jesus properly and we love people properly, we will illumine the world, the culture in which we live. Now, one of the things that I know that we are good at, if we're not good at loving people, one thing that I know I have been really good at, and I didn't even have to read books or take classes on this subject, and this is where we're going to go today. It might be a little bit uncomfortable. I have not read any books, taken any classes. I've not watched any documentaries. I've not gotten any brochures to teach me how to be judgmental and judge people. Are you with me on that? I'm pretty good at judging without having any training on the whole thing. And the culture that we live in, it just teaches us to judge. We naturally draw conclusions about people. And if you're sensitive to that, get over it. Because we naturally draw conclusions about people based upon first appearances. It's just what we do. And I think that comes out of the sin nature inside of us. But all of us are trained. We're trained by the culture that we live in to judge people. Let me give you a little bit of example. You know how to judge people too. All police officers love to eat. See? All blonde women are smart. That's right, okay? All Norwegians are smart. There you go. Thank you. That whole thing. Everybody who drives a vehicle with tinted windows sells. There you go. Drugs. Thank you in the back row. See? That's just kind of we're taught to stereotype people. We're stereotypical. We're taught this in our culture. Now, some of you are already going, oh, I hope I never see Pastor when I'm driving my car. Okay, anyway. So, in fact, we're going to address kind of the subject, one of the most commonly quoted verses by people who profess no relationship with Jesus, and those who do, is this one. Stop judging me. Don't judge me. Now, can I pause here for just a little bit? Let's give a definition to terms, because we're going to talk about really what it means to judge. And sometimes I've heard people approach me, people have said to me, or people, maybe you've even said it, don't judge me. Now, let's just be honest. You don't feel judged. What you feel is guilty. But you interpret it as being judged because you know that the choices you're making are wrong. You know that your lifestyle is wrong. There's something inside of you that tells you this is wrong. And every time I get around those people, every time I get around church people, I'm reminded of what I'm doing wrong, and really what I'm feeling is guilt. But instead of accepting the responsibility of guilt, instead of accepting the responsibility that I'm self-absorbed with my problems, I put it on somebody else and say, stop judging me. It's your fault. It's your problem, not mine. Okay, we got that out of the way. We're good. Now, understand this. Again, to those of us that profess a relationship with Jesus, Jesus left us in this culture to shine light. He left us here to bring hope to people. Jesus did not leave us with the Great Commission saying, go into all the world and impose your values on others. He said, go into all the world, let your light shine in such a way that maybe following me would be appealing to them as well. And so today, for the next few minutes, we're going to kind of address the subject of how do we treat people inside the church and how do we treat people outside the church. Because if we treat people outside the church properly, it might make it appealing to them to want to be inside the church. But we haven't always gotten this right. In fact, if you claim no relationship with Jesus, you're not a Christ follower, you might be watching us online this morning, and you're just kind of checking us all out this morning a little bit. You profess no relationship with Jesus, you might love what I'm about to say. If you're a church person, a churchy person, whatever you want to call yourself, I'm going to give you some responsibilities today, and it might get a little bit uncomfortable. Again, Jesus didn't tell us to go into the world and impose our values on people. He told us that if we live out our faith properly, it'll make it enticing to others to want what we have and what we possess. So for a little bit today, we're going to read somebody else's mail. This is what I love. Much of the New Testament part of your Bible are letters, and a guy named Paul wrote most of the New Testament, and these were really letters that he wrote to a church. And when we read his letters, we can learn some principles that we should apply today to ourselves and to the church. And so today for a little bit, don't you love this? We're going to read somebody else's mail. How many ever wanted to read somebody else's mail? How many have read somebody else's mail? Don't answer that one. Okay, so this guy named Paul, he's an early follower to Jesus, and Paul goes around on a missionary journey, and he starts churches. One of the churches that he starts is in a city called Corinth. Hence, we get letters, Corinthians. We get 1 Corinthians and we get 2 Corinthians. There's actually 4 letters that we know that were written to the church. We only found 2 of them. I didn't steal the other 2, just saying, all right? So this church is in Corinth, and I want to tell you the church in Corinth that Paul is writing to is a mess. And all of the problems that they're dealing with are really very similar to the stuff that we deal with in church today. Why is that? Because sin is sin, right? There's nothing new about sin, and we're redeemed, we're Jesus followers, but we've also got this old sinful nature on the inside of us, and we deal with this. And so he writes this letter. And let me share with you a little bit about how Paul addressed people. Here's a great principle. This is not the focus of the message yet, but look how Paul addresses people, okay? In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse number 20, listen to what Paul says. We're reading his mail again to this church. He said, look, when I was with the Jews, he said, I lived like a Jew, and here's the reason why. I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. And when I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under the Jewish law. Now understand who Paul was. Paul was like, if you looked up Jew in the dictionary, like his picture was right there. This guy was Jewishness to the core. But when he met Jesus Christ, he realized Jesus was the fulfillment of all kinds of stuff the Bible wrote about. His life completely changed, and he realized that righteousness didn't come by obeying the law. It came through Jesus Christ. But he says, when I'm hanging out with Jewish people, I don't tell them where they're wrong. I don't impose my Christian values on the Jews. I could point out all of the fallacies in their beliefs, their lifestyle, their doctrine. I could point out all the fallacies, all the problems. But you know what? My purpose is to win them to Christ. And you don't win anybody when you start a fight with them. He goes on to say, he says this in verse 21. When I am with the Gentiles who don't follow Jewish laws, I too live apart from the law so that I can bring them to Christ. Once again, he says, when I'm hanging out with the Gentiles who do all kinds of things that Jewish people don't do, I could point out all the stuff they're doing wrong. Come on, listen to me, church people. Church people, we find Jesus. Come on, church people, we find Jesus, and Jesus changes our lives, and we get all excited about Jesus. I was delivered from alcohol, and I was pretty sure that anybody who drank alcohol after I discovered Jesus was going straight to hell, and I was quick to point out the problem. And I got so dogmatic about it, I made more enemies than friends. And Paul says, look. You don't need to point out the problems. Most people that got problems know what their problems are. You know what your problems are. And a lot of us know what our, look at the person next to you. You know what their problems are too, don't you? But he wanted to win their hearts. Now, let me ask you this. How many of you have ever won somebody's heart? If you're married, you won somebody's heart. You know what you did? You know how you win somebody's heart? You win somebody's heart by living, acting, behaving in such a way that when that person you want to win looks at you, they realize you're the best option. Do you know why she married you? Come on, guys. You know why she married you? It certainly wasn't for your looks, was it? No. The reason that she married you is because you won her heart. When she looked at all the other options she had in other men, she looked at you and said, this guy is nice to me. He's the best option. And she married you. We want people to see the way that we live, and we live in such a way that when they look at culture, when they look at their life, when they look at the problems in the world, when they look at the hopelessness in their heart, and they see the hope inside of you and the joy that is inside of you, you're the best option. And you're sharing and shining the light in all of their lives. Just do whatever it takes to win them, not manipulate them, not coerce them, not to threaten them. And come on, through the centuries, the church hasn't always gotten this right. I mean, in the most extreme sense, the Crusaders used to march across the land with torches and spears and swords and say, convert or die. That's a great motivation, isn't it? You want to be a Christian, or do you want to get stabbed with a sword? I think I'm going for Jesus today. That's not the way to win people. And we might not use a sword today. But within the church realm, there can be this tendency to say, you know what? You change, or else you're going to burn and go to hell. I want you to join me. Yeah, it's really compelling, Pastor. It's great. No. Now, in the same letter that we've just read from, Paul, this guy who writes the letter, he addresses all kinds of issues, and the way he addresses the issues helps us understand how we should address people inside the church and people outside of the church. So we're going to read this mail today, and what I want you to understand on the whole subject of judgment is this. Come on. I've heard people say this to me. The Bible tells you not to judge. No, it doesn't. The Bible tells us to judge. The Bible doesn't tell us not to judge. It just tells us whom to judge. The Bible does not tell us not to judge. It tells us whom to judge. Now, what I'm about to read to you explains exactly what I mean. We're going to read an example of this in the same letter that Paul writes to this church in Corinth. So read this with me. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse number 1. Here's what Paul writes in his letter. Amongst other things, other topics, other subjects, he says this in his letter. Look, I can hardly believe the report about the sexual immorality going on amongst you, something that even pagans don't do. Pause right there. If you only read that one statement right there, doesn't that pique your curiosity? Like, what's going on in that church that even unbelievers don't even do? Like, don't you just kind of want it? It's like a juicy little gossip thing. Like, what's going on? You can't wait to read on in the letter. But Paul says there's sexual immorality. There's a sexual sin going on inside of you group of believers that is so heinous, so bad, that even pagans, he uses the word pagans, it just means people who are not following Jesus, they don't even do this. He goes on, look at the rest of verse number 1. He says, here's what's going on. I am told that a man in your church is living in sin with a stepmom. Now, you pause right there and go, there's a little bit of kind of an ooh factor there, isn't there? Come on, some of you got stepmoms like, ooh. But here is, I think, what's going on. Commentators seem to think this guy's dad was older, and he marries a woman much younger, because that's sometimes what guys do. Dad kicks the bucket, leaves his widow behind, and now the kid wants to marry his stepmom. Come on, say it with me. Ew, right? Okay, that's what's going on in the church. Look how Paul addresses this. He says in verse number 2, look, you're so proud of yourselves. Pause right there. They weren't proud of this guy's sexual sin. They're like, we're the church in Corinth. We are all it. You need to be like our church. They were all full of pride, promoting themselves. He said, you're so proud of yourselves, but you should be mourning and sorrow and shame, and you should remove this man from your fellowship. Pause right there. Why? He'll explain. Verse number 3. Paul says, look, I might not be with you in person, but I'm with you in spirit. And as though I were there, I have already passed, say that word with me, judgment on this man. Paul, who epitomizes what it means to follow Jesus Christ, judged a man. Here's why. Look what he says. Verse number 5. Here's my judgment. You must throw this man out and hand him over to Satan so that his sinful nature will be destroyed and he himself will be saved on the day that the Lord returns. Now that might sound harsh, but you see what Paul is dealing with here? He's saying, I want this man to be saved. This is for the sake of his soul. For a time, he needs to be excommunicated from your church. Inside the church, under the covering of the church, under the care of the church, there's a sense of protection. You need to put this man on the outside for a time so that he'll want to get back on the inside. This is about his soul. It might sound harsh, but this is concern for this man. Maybe when he says turn him over to Satan, it might be a physical attack. Come on. I don't care how big and beefy and what kind of a brute you might be. Come on, man. But when you got a owie, nothing makes you call upon God faster than when you're in pain, right? You can see a grown man cry in pain. Oh, God, just take this away from me. Why does Paul seem to be so harsh? So that this guy will say, I need God again. I don't know a lot about horses, but I've read this about horses, that if there is a rogue horse in a herd of wild horses, the lead horse will drive the rogue horse out of the herd. It no longer has the protection of the herd. There's protection in numbers and in masses from the wolves and wild animals that want to attack. But this rogue horse is not able to come back into the fold, into the herd, to be protected again. It might travel along with the herd, but it's outside of the herd. And only when the lead horse feels that there's been a change of attitude in that horse, simply by a look from the lead horse to the rogue horse, or a tip or tilt of the head, the rogue horse now knows that it's safe to come back on the inside again and have the protection and the safety of the herd. Paul's saying, you need to deal with this man so that his soul will be saved and he'll know the value of being on the inside of the church. Now, Paul wants to make it very clear who he's talking about so that there's no mistake about who we are and are not supposed to judge. He wants to make it very, very clear to us how to treat people inside the church and people outside the church. Look how he continues the letter in verse number 9. When I wrote to you before, I told you not to associate with people who indulge in sexual sin. Qualifies it a little bit more detail. Look at verse number 10. But I wasn't talking about unbelievers. I'm not talking about people outside the church who indulge in sexual sin or are greedy or cheat people or worship idols. You'd have to leave this world to avoid people like that. He goes on to say in verse number 11, I meant that you're not to associate with anyone, listen to this, who claims to be a believer, yet they indulge in sexual sin or is greedy or worships idols and is abusive or a drunkard or cheats people. Don't even eat with such people. Now, you know what? I know how that might land on the ears of churchgoers. Like, that's really harsh. But listen, if people outside the church wanted to say that we were hypocrites inside the church, they might have a little bit of credibility here. Based upon what Paul just said. These are people who claim to be Jesus followers. Out of their mouth, they say they're a Jesus follower. But when you look at their life doesn't match up with their mouth. That makes them a hypocrite. Now, if people on the outside of the church want to go, thank you, Pastor. Yeah, it's about time you called church people hypocrites. I worked in a bar before I came to know, I want to qualify this, before I came to know Jesus, I worked in a bar. I saw hypocrites in the bar too. I saw married people acting like single people. They'd take off a wedding ring and they'd flirt with the barmaid, they'd flirt with the women that come around there, they were a hypocrite as well. A hypocrite is somebody who is acting one way, but that's not really who they are. Are there hypocrites inside the church? Yeah. Are there hypocrites outside the church? Yeah. Do we have a problem? Yeah, we got a problem. Okay, so let's just address it. Let's just call it for what it is, all right? Now, he says, don't even eat, don't fellowship with such people. Why would Paul say that? You see, here's what he's saying. We're supposed to judge people inside the church, not people outside the church. Why would he say that? Because once these people have enjoyed the covering, the fellowship, the camaraderie, and all the benefits that go along with being inside the church, when you find out they're a hypocrite and they're living like this, you need to put them outside of the church so that they will once again want to be inside the church. And this is concern and care for the person's soul. Now, here's the big idea. Here's the big idea of what we're sharing. Listen to what Paul says in verse number 12. And I think this is really where you and I ought to be today too. Look at verse 12. It isn't my responsibility to judge outsiders, but it's certainly your responsibility to judge those inside the church. Have you ever read that before? You know what the church historically has loved to do? And I say the church, I'm not talking about Lifechurch, I'm talking about the church. Historically in the church, people love to kind of huddle together, band together, withdraw from the culture, and then talk about, within the church, they let us talk about how bad culture is. Have you seen what's going on in all the culture? Have you seen this thing with homosexuality and drug use and just people live, we can just get together and bash culture. And from inside the church, we just lob rocks over the wall and hope we hit somebody on the outside of the church. And Paul says, look. Your responsibility is to deal with your own problems, not their problems. Deal with your own issues, not their issues. Deal with stuff going on inside the walls of the church, not on the outside of the church. And here's why. Look how he sums this whole thing up in the last verse of that chapter, chapter 13. Look, or verse number 13. Look what he says. God will judge those on the outside. Aren't you glad I just lifted that responsibility from your shoulders? You and I we're not responsible to judge people outside the church. And all of us should go, I'm really glad for that. But we need to take care of business on the inside of the church. Is it possible that the reason people don't want to go to church is the people inside the church were judging people on the outside of the church? And look, you can engage people outside of the church with the law, or you can engage people outside of the church with love. And which one do you think will compel them towards Jesus more? When I first came to faith in Jesus Christ, I became a letter-writing maniac. I'm just telling you, man. I wrote letters to people I was convinced were going to go to hell when they died, and I wrote letters and told them how they need to get right with Jesus and stop doing this and start doing that whole kind of thing. And nobody ever wrote me back, thank you so much. I just appreciate that. In fact, they're not even at church today. What if I would have engaged them in a relationship? But in my zeal, I burned the bridge. Traditionally, the church just loves judging people on the outside, but not dealing with the problems on the inside. We like judging people on the outside. You know, I thought about this. We've got house rules. You know, I grew up with house rules. We don't have house rules anymore, Robin and me, because we're empty nesters, right? You don't have to worry about house rules. But growing up, we had house rules. How many got house rules in your house? You got house rules? Here's some of the house rules I grew up with. Supper time was at 6 o'clock. And when you sat at the supper table, there was no singing at the table, no belching at the table, no elbows on the table. Are you with me? Okay, those were our house rules. Some of you like to play board games. You like to play board games. And how many of you ever know you got a board game, you're playing the game, and let's say it's Uno. You're playing the game of Uno, all right? And we play it when you get down to 2 cards left. You have to holler Uno. If you don't holler Uno before somebody else does, you got to draw 2 more cards. No, you might not play it that way. Now, far be it from me to go to somebody else's house, like boom, boom, boom. I can knock on my neighbor's house at supper time, boom, boom, boom. Hey, I'm just checking here with your kids. Do they have their elbows on the table? Because if they do, they're in trouble. You would never go to your neighbor's house and impose your rules on them. But within the church, we learn the rules, and we're good at learning the rules, and we think it's our mission and our commission from Jesus to go impose our rules on the rest of the world. And if we do that, we're not shining light at all. Don't impose house rules on other people. And look, I could summarize it like this. Okay, you ready for this? This is going to sound a little corny, but I thought if I could summarize this whole thing up, it'd be like this, that we can shine brightly by judging the believing, not the heathen. Okay? We can shine brightly when we start judging the believing and not the heathen. Okay, you didn't like that one. All right. We can start shining brightly when we judge people inside the church and not outside the church. Because look, there's people outside the church, and you know why they're not here today? Because they're afraid to be here. There's a need in their life. There's an emptiness in their life. There's a hollowness in their heart. But there's things going on inside their lives that they're doing to try to fill the hollow spots. They're living with somebody. They're out looking for sex every night with somebody to try to fill that hollow spot. They're engaged in drugs. They've got an addiction. There's something going on in their life. And somehow the church has given the wrong impression to those people to make them feel in such a way that if I come through the doors of the church, people are going to judge me. And that the culture needs to change. You know, I can remember hearing comments in the church years and years ago. In this church, it was like 30 years ago. I can remember hearing some of the old saints. I think they've all died and gone home to be with Jesus now. But they said, "Oh, can you believe it? There's cigarette butts in the parking lot." Well, that sure welcomes people through the doors, doesn't it? And I'm thinking, praise God, there's cigarette butts. And I don't care. We put a cigarette butt can in our parking lot. We want people to know that we don't judge them on the outside. We judge people on the inside. How many people love coming to church and love Jesus because they love feeling judged? I don't know if anybody does. But how many would say, I think Jesus could be a little bit appealing if first he would just accept me for who I am and what I am and where I am? They don't have to change before they follow Jesus, but they'll begin to change as they follow Jesus. All of this, I don't know how this lands in your heart. All of this causes me, as I put this together for you, I thought, I just got to pause here for a little bit. Because I can get an attitude. And attitudes, thoughts, can start to ooze out of us. And then we start to say things and do things that are unfriendly to those outside the church. We need to be aware of the conversations we have when we go to a restaurant. We start talking about those people, those people, those people. And there's somebody in the booth behind us or across from us listening to us talk about those people. And then they hear us talk about church and talk about Jesus. And they're like, see, case in point, I don't want any part of that. If we start loving people on the outside, if we start loving people on the outside, maybe it will lead them to change on the inside. And I don't know about you, but I want to be a part of that change in somebody's life. There's nothing more exhilarating, more exciting than seeing people walk to the front of a church and saying, I yield my life to Jesus Christ. And we will just take them where they are. And we'll put aside our prejudices. We'll put aside all those things because you know what? If it wasn't for the grace of God, we would still be on the outside. But by the grace of God, we have found our way to the inside. And if it was the grace of God that led us to the inside, let's extend that same grace to people on the outside. And if there's problems we need to deal with on the inside, let's deal with them. Maybe today you've experienced and heard some truth through God's word that maybe would make a difference for you. Maybe you know somebody, you've been trying to be Jesus to them, share your faith with them, and maybe the approach has been all wrong. Come on. Let me just give you a little bit of an example. This is probably a horrible example, but this is me. In junior high, out of my great uncle's farm north of Williston, my dad decided we're going to raise some pigs, and we're going to raise pigs and have money for the kids for college or whatever case might be. Just, I raised my pigs and I bought a really nice stereo. That's where my money went, okay? And I remember we were loading up pigs one day to take them into the sale, down here to the sales barn. And Dad had a stock rack in the back of the pickup, and there was a ramp that led up to this back end, and we're trying to get this pig up there so we could take it to sale. And I think I had a rope around the front leg of this pig. You can't put a rope around its neck because it'll slide right off. You pull it the wrong direction. And I remember standing on this ramp, and I'm pulling. I mean, I was all of maybe 180 pounds, and I'm pulling on this pig to get it into the back of the pickup truck. And my dad said something so profound, stuck with me until this day. Dad said, that pig is not going to come towards anything it's afraid of. But Dad, you're brilliant, you know. And you can go and try to win people to Jesus and try to pull them, coerce them, threaten them. But they're not going to come towards that. But you can get alongside of them and say, let's do this together. Look, I've been where you've been. I've been where you've been. And sometimes we just have to understand people and get to know them and figure out why they are the way they are. I had a classmate. Her name was Lori. Lori was always overweight. And I felt sorry for her because people teased me about my visual impairment. So I knew the scorn and the pain of being the source of ridicule all the time. And people teased her about being fat. And I remember going one night, I'm hanging out at Davidson Park. Yeah, Davidson Park. It was still there. It didn't have any trees probably, but it was still there. You know, Davidson Park. And Lori is there. Christy is there. Becky is there. And I'd never had one-to-one interaction with Lori before that night. It was just a classmate in school over here at Wilkinson School. And I remember now this was an opportunity to get to know Lori. And I heard Lori's heart for the first time in grade 6. Lori said, people tease me about being fat. And she said, the reason I'm fat is I have a hormonal imbalance and a hormone problem. And nothing I can do will help me lose that weight. I just got into her life. And suddenly I felt an empathy for her. I understand, I get it now. And unfortunately, the tragedy of that story is 4 years later, her sophomore year of high school, the scorn kept on to the point she took her life. If only more people had taken the time to get to know who she was, they wouldn't have judged her for the way she looked. Let's get into the lives of people on the outside of the church to understand them, why they do what they do, why they are where they are, before we pass judgment.